Cigarette ash dropped onto the imported Persian rug, a dull grey smudge sinking into woven silk. Nico didn't blink. He was staring at the woman wringing out a sponge in his kitchen. Tessa. She wasn't a rival boss, an informant, or a threat. She was just the girl who bleached the grout in his bathrooms. Yet, when she quietly mumbled she'd be late tomorrow evening because she had a date, the air in the room didn't just freeze. It fractured. The harsh, chemical reek of industrial bleach masked the lingering scent of copper that sometimes haunted the lower halls of the estate. Tessa preferred the bleach. It was honest. It burned the inside of her nose and made her eyes water, but it did exactly what it promised to do. It erased things. She knelt on the cold expanse of Italian marble in the kitchen, a yellow sponge gripped tightly in her chapped red hands. The abrasive green side was worn down to a fuzzy mint, exhausted from hours of scrubbing away scuff marks, spilled espresso, and the occasional, unexplained dark stain. Her knees ached. A dull, throbbing pain that radiated up her thighs, the kind of ache that settled into the bone and stayed there. A permanent reminder of her tax bracket. The house was completely silent. It was a sprawling, sterile monument to new money and old sins, perched on a rocky cliffside in Massachusetts. The windows were floor to ceiling, thick, bullet-resistant glass that held back the roaring Atlantic wind, but also trapped the suffocating stillness inside. Tessa wrung out the sponge over the stainless steel bucket. The dirty water slapped against the plastic sides. She didn't hear him walk in. Nico moved like a man who spent his life expecting the floorboards to give way. No heavy boot steps. No clearing of the throat. Just a sudden, heavy shift in the room's air pressure. Tessa felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle before she actually saw him. She sat back on her heels, swiping a stray strand of dull brown hair from her forehead with the back of a damp wrist. He was standing by the island, pouring himself a glass of water. He wore a dark, unstructured suit, the tie already discarded, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked exhausted. There were violet shadows bruised into the skin under his eyes, and his jaw was covered in the dark, rough shadow of a 3-day beard. He smelled of cold rain, stale tobacco, and the faint, bitter tang of expensive scotch. "Sorry," Tessa muttered, immediately dropping her gaze. It was a rule she had made for herself months ago. Never look him in the eye for longer than 3 seconds. He wasn't a man. He was a weather event, a hurricane trapped in a bespoke suit. "I was just finishing the grout. I'll be out of your way." Nico didn't say anything. He just lifted the glass to his lips, the ice clinking sharply against the heavy crystal. The sound was deafening in the quiet kitchen. He drank slowly, his eyes fixed on her over the rim of the glass. It wasn't a predatory stare. It was worse. It was an autopsy. He was picking her apart, observing the frayed hem of her grey uniform pants, the way her shoulders hunched defensively, the raw knuckles of her right hand. He hated that he noticed these things. He managed a syndicate that spanned the eastern seaboard. He had shipping containers full of illicit cargo sitting at the docks, politicians waiting on his phone calls, and men who would kill or die on his whim. Yet, for the past 4 months, he knew exactly what time the maid took her lunch. He knew she drank her coffee black because she couldn't afford milk before payday. He knew the left heel of her work shoe squeaked on the hardwood. It was pathetic, a flaw in his system. He had tried firing her twice in his head, but every time she showed up at 7 a.m., smelling like cheap vanilla soap and exhaustion, a strange, terrible calm settled over him. Tessa pushed herself up from the floor, grabbing the heavy plastic bucket by the wire handle. The metal bit into her palm. She needed to speak. She had been putting it off all day, dreading the interaction, but tomorrow was Friday. If she didn't say it now, She'd lose her deposit on the reservation. "Mr. Falco," she started, her voice sounding entirely too thin. Nico set the glass down, a sharp clack against the granite. "What?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "I need to adjust my hours for tomorrow," she said, staring intently at the third button of his shirt. "I'll be coming in at 5 in the morning instead of 7, to finish the upstairs." Nico frowned, a minute tightening of the muscles around his mouth. He didn't like changes in the schedule. Routine kept the paranoia at bay. "Why?" Tessa shifted her weight. The bucket sloshed. "I have to leave by 4 in the afternoon. I won't be able to stay for the dinner prep cleanup." "I asked why, Tessa, not what time." His voice was low, gravelly, vibrating with a quiet authority that made her stomach tighten. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. They were a flat, unreadable brown, like dirty river water. "I have a date tomorrow night. I need time to get ready." The words hung in the air, heavy and awkward. Nico didn't move. He didn't blink. But deep inside his chest, right beneath the sternum, something violently snapped. It was a physical sensation, like a guitar string breaking and lashing against his ribs. The air in his lungs suddenly felt hot and entirely too thin. A date. The concept was alien. It belonged to the normal world, the world of traffic jams, mortgage rates, and small talk over appetizers. It didn't belong in his house. It didn't belong to her. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her skin was pale, devoid of makeup. She looked tired, small, and entirely unremarkable. And yet, the thought of another man sitting across from her, buying her a drink, looking at her mouth, made a sickening wave of pure, unfiltered bile rise in his throat. "A date," Nico repeated. The words tasted like ash. "Yes." Tessa swallowed hard, her grip on the bucket handle turning her knuckles white. She didn't understand the expression on his face. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely blank, like a television screen that had just lost its signal. "Who?" The word slipped out before his pride could stop it. Tessa blinked, caught off guard by the intrusion. "Just someone. A guy from my neighborhood." Nico felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. A guy from her neighborhood. Some working-class stiff who smelled of cheap cologne and drove a financed sedan. Someone who would hold the door for her and ask her about her day, completely oblivious to the fact that she spent her mornings scrubbing the blood of his enemies out of the basement floor drains. "Fine," Nico said smoothly, though his heart was hammering a frantic, ugly rhythm against his ribs. "Leave at 4. Make sure the security system is armed when you go." He turned his back on her before she could reply, walking out of the kitchen with stiff, measured steps. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked at her again, he was terrified he might rip the plastic bucket out of her hands and demand she cancel it. Tessa stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She had got what she wanted. The time off was approved. But as she poured the dirty bleach water down the heavy steel sink, she felt a profound, unsettling dread settling into her stomach. The thermostat in the office was set to 68 degrees, but Nico was sweating. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the leather chair creaking softly as he shifted his weight. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, yellow glow of a brass desk lamp. Outside, the rain had started. A hard, driving downpour that slapped against the reinforced glass like a handful of gravel. Nico stared at the quarterly ledgers spread out before him. Rows of numbers, supply chain logistics, offshore account balances. Meaningless grey blur. For the past 3 hours, he had been trying to focus on a discrepancy in the Miami shipments. Instead, his mind was playing a relentless, agonizing loop of a single sentence. I have a date. He reached for the crystal tumbler on his desk. The scotch was warm now, the ice long melted, diluting the amber liquid into a sad, watered-down mess. He drank it anyway. It burned his throat, but it didn't touch the tight, suffocating knot in his chest. He was losing his mind. He knew he was losing his mind. He was a 34-year-old man who had ordered executions over cold plates of pasta. He had sat across from cartel bosses and smiled while negotiating the price of human lives. He did not care about the maid. He could not care about the maid. She was an employee, a utility, like the expensive HVAC system humming in the ceiling or the reinforced steel gate at the end of the driveway. She kept his environment sterile. That was it. But then he remembered the way she hummed when she thought she was alone in the East Wing. He remembered the smell of the cheap vanilla lotion she rubbed into her cracked hands during her breaks. He remembered the quiet, exhausted defiance in her eyes when he accidentally broke a glass and she had to sweep it up. She never complained, but she never cowered either. She just survived him. And Nico, a man who destroyed everything he touched, had become quietly obsessed with the one thing in his house that simply endured him. He slammed the empty glass down on the desk. The sharp sound echoed in the cavernous room. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen glared brightly in the dim room. He scrolled past names of politicians, fixers and killers, stopping on a simple contact. Rocco. He pressed dial. It rang twice. "Boss." Rocco's voice was thick with sleep. It was past 1 in the morning. "Wake up," Nico said, his voice flat, devoid of the absolute panic clawing at his insides. "I need a run on someone." There was a rustle of sheets over the line, a heavy sigh. Rocco was a professional. He didn't ask questions. "Give me a name." "I don't have a name." Nico pinched the bridge of his nose, squeezing his eyes shut. God, he was pathetic. "I need you to pull the security footage from the front gate. Cross-reference the plates of whoever picks up Tessa tomorrow night at 6. Silence hung on the line for a long, heavy moment. The only sound was the static hum of the cellular connection. "Tessa?" Rocco finally asked. "The cleaning girl?" "Yes." "Did she steal something?" Rocco's tone shifted, the sleepiness vanishing, replaced by cold, professional suspicion. "You want me to send someone over to her place?" "No!" Nico snapped, louder than he intended. He forced his breathing to slow down. "She didn't steal anything. She's going out. I want to know who is taking her. Full background, financials, criminal history, ex-girlfriends, everything. I want the file on my desk by 7. "You want a full workup on the Maid's date?" Rocco asked, unable to keep the sheer bewilderment out of his voice. "Did I stutter, Rocco?" "No, boss. I'm on it." Nico hung up. He dropped the phone onto the desk. It landed with a dull thud. He leaned back in his chair and stared up at the dark, coffered ceiling. He felt physically sick. The self-loathing was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He was abusing his power, invading her privacy, acting like a deranged, jealous teenager. He told himself it was a security measure. She had access to the entire house. She knew his schedules. If she was dating someone, that someone was a potential vulnerability. It was standard protocol to vet anyone who got close to his staff. It was a lie, and he knew it. He didn't care about security. He cared about the fact that tomorrow night, some faceless idiot was going to make her laugh. Some guy was going to pull out her chair, look across a candle-lit table, and see the soft curve of her jaw, the tired but beautiful slope of her shoulders. Some guy was going to think he had the right to touch her, Nico's hand curled into a fist, his fingernails biting into his own palm, hard enough to break the skin. He welcomed the pain. It was sharp and grounding, a distraction from the humiliating, hollow ache in his chest. By 6 a.m, the file was sitting in his email inbox. Nico sat at the kitchen island, a mug of black coffee going cold in front of him. His eyes burned from lack of sleep as he stared at the tablet screen. The guy's name was Simon Hayes, 32, regional manager for a mid-tier logistics firm. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket in the last 5 years. Credit score of 740. He drove a grey 2019 Honda Accord. He volunteered at a local animal shelter on weekends. He owned a golden retriever. He was sickeningly, outrageously normal. Nico scrolled through a few photos Rocco had scraped from social media. Simon holding a fish he caught. Simon smiling at a company picnic, wearing a beige polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts. Simon had a kind, open face, with crinkling eyes and a soft, non-threatening smile. Nico hated him with a sudden, violent intensity that scared him. If Simon had been a rival thug, a deadbeat, or a criminal, Nico would have had an excuse to intervene. He could have played the benevolent employer, protecting his naive staff from a banned element. But Simon was a good man, a safe man. He was exactly the kind of man a woman like Tessa deserved, someone who could offer her quiet weekends, a mortgage in the suburbs, and a life entirely devoid of bulletproof glass and bleach. Nico turned the screen off. The reflection of his own face stared back at him in the black glass. Dark eyes, a hard, unforgiving mouth. A man who dealt in threats and violence. He didn't fit into Tessa's world, and he knew, with a crushing certainty, that dragging her into his would destroy her. He had to let her go on the date. He had to stand back and watch her walk out the door into a normal life. He took a sip of the cold coffee. It tasted like battery acid. Friday evening felt heavier than usual. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind a thick, suffocating humidity that clung to the skin. The air smelled of wet pavement, crushed pine needles, and the briny decay of the ocean. Tessa stood in the small, windowless staff bathroom on the ground floor, staring at herself in the harsh, fluorescent mirror. She looked different, and she wasn't sure she liked it. She had swapped her shapeless grey uniform for a dress she had bought from a vintage thrift store 2 years ago. It was dark emerald green, made of a cheap synthetic silk that clung slightly to her hips and draped modestly past her knees. It wasn't glamorous. The zipper was sticky, and there was a tiny, almost imperceptible fray at the left seam, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She had brushed her hair out, letting it fall in soft, brown waves over her shoulders, and applied a thin coat of drugstore mascara. She sprayed a mist of vanilla body spray into the air and walked through it, wrinkling her nose slightly at the artificial sweetness. It was the best she could do. Her stomach fluttered with a nervous, sickening anxiety. She hadn't been on a date in 3 years. Between her mother's medical bills and the exhausting hours at the Falco estate, romance was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Simon had been persistent, in a gentle, polite way, when they met at the grocery store. He seemed safe. And God, she was so tired of being entirely alone. She zipped her cheap faux leather purse, took a deep breath, and opened the bathroom door. Nico was waiting in the foyer. He wasn't standing by the door. He was sitting in the high-backed leather wing chair near the staircase, a newspaper open on his lap. But he wasn't reading. He was perfectly still, a predator feigning rest. He wore dark jeans and a black Henley that stretched tight across his chest. He looked impossibly large in the dim lighting of the entryway. Tessa's footsteps faltered on the marble. The click-clack of her low heels echoed off the high ceiling. Nico slowly lowered the newspaper. The paper rustled, loud as a gunshot in the quiet house. His eyes tracked her movement as she descended the last 3 stairs. The physical impact of seeing her hit him like a physical blow. The emerald green of the dress brought out a hidden warmth in her pale skin. Her neck looked long, incredibly fragile. She smelled of cheap vanilla and nervous sweat, a scent so deeply human, so entirely vulnerable, that it made his teeth ache. She didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like a woman. A beautiful, tired woman who was leaving him behind. "Mr. Falco," she said, her voice tight. "I'm heading out. The security system is primed. You just need to punch in your code to lock it down." Nico stood up. He didn't say anything at first. He just closed the distance between them, his movement slow, deliberate. Tessa instinctively took a half step back, her shoulder bumping against the heavy oak of the front door. He stopped 2 feet away from her, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her skin, close enough to see the frantic, rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. "You're taking an Uber?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly scrape. "No," Tessa swallowed, refusing to look higher than his chest. "He's picking me up, at the main gate." "The gate is a half-mile walk in the dark," Nico said, his tone perfectly conversational, though his eyes were completely dead. "I'll have Rocco drive you down in the SUV." "That's really not necessary," Tessa said quickly. The panic was rising in her chest. The idea of Rocco, Nico's terrifying silent shadow of a driver, dropping her off for a date with an HR manager, was absurd. "It's a nice evening. I don't mind the walk." "I mind," Nico said softly. Tessa finally looked up, meeting his eyes. What she saw there made her breath hitch. It wasn't anger. It was a dark, suffocating possessiveness, raw and entirely unmasked. He was looking at her like she was something that belonged to him, something he was reluctantly allowing out of its cage. "Mr. Falco," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "Nico," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't work for me right now, Tessa. You're off the clock." "Call me Nico." She stared at him, her mind blanking. The space between them felt electrified, heavy with unspoken threats and an incredibly confusing, dark pull. She wanted to run out the door. She wanted to step closer to him. The contradiction made her dizzy. "I need to go," she whispered, her hand fumbling blindly behind her for the brass doorknob. "I'll be late." Nico looked at her hand on the knob. He could stop her. All he had to do was reach out, wrap his hand around her wrist, and tell her she wasn't leaving. He could lock the door. He could offer her enough money to never look at Simon Hayes again. The urge to do it was a physical agony, tearing at his self-control. But he saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the wide, trapped animal look. He slowly exhaled, stepping back, putting a foot of cold air between them. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets so she wouldn't see them shaking. "Have a good time," he said, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. Tessa didn't hesitate. She turned the knob, yanked the heavy door open, and slipped out into the humid night air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, the automatic locking mechanism engaging with a solid, metallic thunk. Nico stood in the empty foyer. The silence of the house came rushing back in, heavier and more oppressive than ever. The faint scent of cheap vanilla lingered in the air where she had been standing. He looked at his watch. 6:15 p.m. He stood there for exactly 3 minutes. He listened to the hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen. He listened to the wind rattling the glass panes. He listened to his own pulse hammering a relentless, chaotic beat in his ears. He's a good man. He's safe. Let her go. The rational thought played in his head, but it sounded hollow. Nico swore softly, a vicious, violent curse that echoed off the marble walls. He walked over to the console table, grabbed the keys to the black Range Rover, and walked out the door. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just knew he couldn't sit in this empty house and picture another man's hands on her waist. He was going to follow her. It was insane, it was dangerous, and it was exactly the kind of mistake that got men in his position killed. But as his hand wrapped around the cold leather of the steering wheel, he didn't care. The rain started again, a fine, misty drizzle that smeared the streetlights into blurry halos against the windshield of the Range Rover. Nico kept 2 car lengths between his heavy, armored SUV and the grey Honda Accord. The tracking was effortless. It was a pathetic, agonizingly slow parade through the dreary, rain-slicked suburbs of the South Shore. No evasive maneuvers, no sudden turns down blind alleys. Simon drove exactly 3 miles below the speed limit, braking a full 50 yards before every red light. Nico sat in the dark, the leather of the steering wheel groaning faintly under his white-knuckled grip. The interior of the SUV smelled of expensive leather, ozone from the air conditioning, and his own nervous sweat. He was a man who operated in the shadows of the eastern seaboard, a man who orchestrated the movement of millions of dollars of contraband. And here he was, burning premium gas to tail an HR manager to a mid-tier gastropub. The self-disgust was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of his throat. The Honda finally pulled into the crowded parking lot of a place called the Copper Fox. A neon sign buzzed aggressively above the entrance, casting a harsh orange glow over the wet asphalt. Nico parked across the street in the shadow of a closed auto body shop, killing the engine. He didn't turn on the radio. He just sat in the heavy, suffocating silence, watching. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he saw Simon step out, open a black umbrella, and jog around to the passenger side. Simon opened the door for Tessa. He held the umbrella over her as she stepped out into the puddles, her cheap emerald dress clinging slightly to her legs in the damp wind. Nico's jaw locked. A muscle ticked violently beneath his right eye. Simon placed a hand lightly on the small of Tessa's back to guide her toward the entrance. It was a polite, standard gesture, a gentlemanly touch. Inside the dark cabin of the SUV, Nico's hand dropped instinctively to the heavy, cold grip of the Sig Sauer resting in his shoulder holster. His fingers curled around the textured metal. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe in through his nose, out through his mouth. "Stop it," he told himself. "You are losing your grip." He opened his eyes and watched them disappear through the heavy wooden doors of the pub. He waited. He told himself to turn the key in the ignition, put the truck in drive, and go back to his empty, silent fortress on the cliffs. Let her eat her overpriced burger. Let her listen to Simon talk about his golden retriever and his 401k. Let her be normal. 5 minutes passed. The windshield fogged over from his body heat. Nico grabbed a rag from the center console and wiped a crude circle in the condensation on the glass. He peered through it, squinting at the large plate glass windows of the pub. He could see them. They were seated in a booth near the front. The lighting inside was warm, casting a yellowish hue over the table. Simon was talking animatedly, using his hands. Tessa was nodding, but Nico knew her. He knew the micro-expressions that meant she was retreating inward. He saw the stiff, unnatural line of her shoulders. She was sitting rigidly upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap beneath the table. She wasn't relaxing into the booth. She was enduring it. When the waiter brought their drinks, Simon reached across the table and lightly touched the back of Tessa's hand. Tessa flinched. It was a tiny movement, barely a fraction of an inch, masked quickly by her reaching for her water glass. But Nico caught it. That was it. The frayed, over-tightened string of his self-control snapped with a deafening internal crack. Nico shoved the door of the Range Rover open. He didn't grab a coat. He stepped out into the freezing drizzle, slamming the heavy armored door behind him. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, industrial street. He crossed the wet asphalt, his strides long, predatory, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He didn't know what he was going to do, but sitting in the dark while another man touched her was no longer a physical possibility. The bell above the door of the Copper Fox jingled merrily as Nico pushed inside. The sensory shift was jarring. The air was thick, suffocatingly warm, and smelled heavily of fried garlic, stale draft beer, and damp wool coats. A jukebox in the corner was playing a muffled classic rock song, competing with the loud, overlapping chatter of 30 different conversations. Nico stood in the entryway, a dark, imposing tear in the bright, mundane fabric of the room. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair onto the shoulders of his charcoal suit jacket. He didn't move. He simply let his eyes sweep the room, stripping away the noise and the crowd until he locked onto the booth by the window. He didn't march over to their table. He wasn't a drunk, and he wasn't a fool. He was a predator, and predators knew how to use space. He walked slowly to the heavy, sticky wooden bar that ran along the center of the room. The bartender, a college kid with a messy bun and a stained apron, took one look at Nico's dead eyes and the sharp, expensive cut of his suit, and instantly forgot the joke he was telling the regulars. "What can I get you, sir?" the kid asked, his voice losing its casual bravado. "Bourbon." "Neat. Leave the bottle," Nico said. His voice was quiet, barely carrying over the noise of the room, but the bartender heard it perfectly. Nico sat on a stool that faced the large, mirrored backing of the bar. From this angle, he had a perfect, unobstructed view of the reflection of Tessa's booth behind him. He poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid into the thick glass. He didn't drink it. He just held it, letting the heat of his palm warm the crystal, his eyes locked on the mirror. In the reflection, Simon was showing Tessa something on his phone. A video, probably. Simon was laughing. Tessa was forcing a smile, but her fingers were busy tearing a cardboard drink coaster into microscopic, ragged shreds. It was an anxiety tic. Nico had seen her do it a dozen times when she was waiting for him to finish a phone call before cleaning his office. Nico rotated the glass on the sticky bar top. The ice-cold detachment he usually carried into hostile negotiations was gone, replaced by a dark, volatile heat in his blood. Then it happened. Tessa looked up from the phone. She glanced aimlessly toward the center of the room, her eyes wandering over the crowd as if searching for an exit. Her gaze swept past the bar, moved on, and then violently snapped back. In the mirror, their eyes met. The color instantly drained from Tessa's face, leaving her a sickly, translucent white. Her hand jerked, knocking against the side of her water glass. The heavy tumbler tipped, spilling ice and water across the varnished wood of the table with a sharp clatter. The sound barely registered over the noise of the pub, but to Tessa it was deafening. She couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs simply vanished. The loud chatter of the pub, the classic rock on the jukebox, the smell of the fried food, it all dropped away, leaving a ringing, terrified silence in her ears. Nico was here. He was sitting at the bar, 15 feet away, watching her in the mirror. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't making a scene. His expression was entirely blank, cold, and utterly terrifying. It was the look he wore when a shipment went missing, or when a lieutenant lied to him. It was the look of a man calculating exactly how to dismantle a problem. And right now, Simon was the problem. "Oh, shoot," Simon said, grabbing a handful of cheap paper napkins from the dispenser and frantically dabbing at the spilled water. Are you all right, Tessa? Did it get on your dress?" Tessa didn't hear him. Her hands were trembling under the table. She stared at the back of Nico's broad shoulders, his dark suit completely out of place among the flannel and denim of the pub crowd. Why was he here? Had she forgotten to lock the safe? Had she left a door unalarmed? No. She knew exactly why he was here, and the realization sent a cold, sharp spike of absolute panic through her stomach. "Tessa?" Simon asked again, his voice pulling her back to the immediate reality. He was looking at her with genuine concern. "Hey, you look like you just saw a ghost. You okay?" Tessa tore her eyes away from the mirror. She forced herself to look at Simon's kind, oblivious face. "I'm fine," she choked out, her voice raspy and thin. Just swallowed down the wrong pipe. "Excuse me. I need to use the restroom." She didn't wait for him to reply. She scrambled out of the booth, her legs feeling like lead. She kept her head down, refusing to look at the bar, practically sprinting toward the back of the restaurant, where a dim, red exit sign glowed above a heavy steel door. Nico watched her reflection disappear into the hallway. He set the glass of bourbon down on the bar. He didn't leave a tip. He turned on his stool, his boots thudding softly against the worn floorboards, and followed her. Tessa didn't go to the restroom. She hit the push bar of the heavy steel emergency exit, shoving it open with her shoulder. An alarm didn't sound. It was just a service door for the kitchen staff, but the heavy hinges groaned in protest. She stumbled out into the narrow alleyway behind the pub. The cold, wet air hit her flushed face like a physical slap. She leaned heavily against the rough, damp brick wall, pressing her hands against her chest as if she could manually slow her frantic heartbeat. The alley smelled of wet garbage, rotting cardboard, and grease from the kitchen exhaust vents. A dying halogen bulb above the door flickered erratically, casting long, twitching shadows across the wet pavement. She closed her eyes, dragging oxygen into her burning lungs. She was losing her mind. She had to be. Mr. Falco didn't follow the help. He barely acknowledged her existence 90% of the time. This was a coincidence. He had business nearby. He was just stopping for a drink. The heavy steel door groaned open again, the sound scraping against the brick walls. Tessa's eyes flew open. Nico stepped out into the alley. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the muffled noise of the pub, leaving them entirely alone in the damp, flickering darkness. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood a few feet away, the rain misting over the broad shoulders of his suit. The dim light carved harsh shadows into the hard angles of his jaw. He looked incredibly dangerous, a shark dragged into a shallow pool. "What are you doing here?" Tessa asked. Her voice shook badly. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop the tremor. Nico took a slow step forward. The soles of his boots crunched against a piece of broken glass on the wet asphalt. "Getting a drink." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, a sudden, desperate flare of anger piercing through her terror. "You don't drink here. You drink scotch that costs more than my rent. You live in a fortress on a cliff. This is a strip mall in the suburbs. You followed me." Nico stopped. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping away her anger, finding the raw, terrified core underneath. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't try to gaslight her. "Yes," he said softly. "I followed you." The sheer, unapologetic honesty of it knocked the breath out of her all over again. She pressed herself harder against the brick wall, the rough surface biting into her bare shoulders through the cheap fabric of her dress. "Why?" she whispered. Nico stepped closer, invading her space. He stopped just inches away. The smell of him, rain, expensive bourbon, and a dark, male heat completely overpowered the stench of the alley. Tessa had to tilt her head back, to maintain eye contact. He raised a hand, slowly. Tessa flinched, her eyes widening, but he didn't touch her. He planted his large palm flat against the wet brick, right next to her head, boxing her in. "Because," Nico said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly vibration that she felt in her chest. "You look like you're attending a funeral in there, Tessa." "I am on a date," she said, her voice breathy, defensive. "You're tearing drink coasters to pieces," he countered smoothly, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "Your shoulders are up to your ears. He touched your hand, and you looked like you wanted to crawl under the table. You are miserable." "He's a nice man," Tessa argued, though she felt the argument crumbling. She was defending a life she didn't even know if she wanted, just to fight off the suffocating gravity of the man standing in front of her. "He's normal." "I want nice. I want normal." "You want a pulse," Nico said, his voice harsh, laced with a sudden, bitter cruelty. "You are bored to tears. He doesn't see you, Tessa. He sees a quiet girl in a green dress. He doesn't know what you are. And what am I?" she challenged, her chin tipping up, a spark of pure defiance fighting through the fear. "I'm the girl who scrubs the blood out of your basement floor drains, Mr. Falco. I'm the girl who cleans up after your messes." Nico's jaw tightened. The words hit him like physical blows, precisely because they were true. He hated what he dragged her into, the peripheral violence she had to witness just to pay her bills. "Don't call me that," he said quietly, his voice tight. "Not tonight." "That's who you are," Tessa insisted, her chest heaving. "You're my boss. You are a dangerous man. And you have absolutely no right to be here, ruining the one normal night I've had in 3 years. "I'm not ruining it," Nico said, leaning in a fraction of an inch closer. The heat radiating off his body was overwhelming. "I'm ending it. You are going back inside. You are telling the HR manager you have a headache, and you are coming with me." Tessa stared at him, completely stunned by the audacity, the sheer, arrogant command. "No," Nico's eyes darkened. The flat, dead look vanished, replaced by a chaotic, terrifying storm of possessiveness. He pulled his hand away from the brick wall and hovered it inches from her waist, his fingers twitching, fighting a brutal, internal war against the urge to grab her and drag her to the car. "Tessa," he warned, his voice a dangerous, low scrape. "No," she repeated, louder this time, pushing her hands against his chest. It was like pushing against a concrete pillar. He didn't budge. "You don't own me. You buy my time from 7 to 4. It is 7:30 on a Friday. You do not own me." Nico looked down at her hands pressed against his chest. He could feel the frantic, rapid flutter of her pulse vibrating through her palms. She was terrified of him, and yet she was fighting him. It was intoxicating. It was maddening. He looked back up at her face. The rain was dampening her hair, plastering stray brown strands to her pale cheeks. She looked small, fragile, and utterly breathtaking. "Go back inside, then," Nico said, his voice suddenly dropping to a hoarse, jagged whisper. He stepped back, putting 2 feet of cold, damp air between them. Tessa blinked, caught entirely off guard by the sudden retreat. "What?" "Go back inside," he repeated, his hands balling into fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. "Go sit in the booth. Let him buy you another water. Let him touch your hand." He held her gaze, his eyes burning with a dark, suffocating intensity that made the alley feel smaller, tighter. "But know this," Nico added, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear it over the steady hiss of the rain. "If you go back in there and let him put his hands on you again, I won't just sit at the bar and watch." The threat wasn't loud. It wasn't screamed. It was delivered with the calm, chilling certainty of a man who dealt in absolute destruction. Tessa stood frozen against the wet brick, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She looked at Nico, at the dark, unraveling monster standing in the rain, and for the first time, she realized he wasn't just dangerous to others. He was incredibly, completely dangerous to himself, and he was dragging her down with him. The rain was coming down harder now, heavy drops bouncing off the asphalt of the alleyway, soaking through the shoulders of Nico's suit and plastering Tessa's hair to her neck. She stared at him. The dim, flickering light of the halogen bulb caught the sharp angles of his face, casting his eyes into impenetrable shadow. He meant it. Every single word. He wouldn't just sit at the bar. If she walked back in there, sat down in that cracked vinyl booth and let Simon smile at her, Nico would tear the entire evening apart. He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't throw a punch. He would just walk over, a predator invading a petting zoo, and systematically dismantle Simon Hayes with the sheer, terrifying weight of what he was. He would make sure Simon knew exactly who was watching, and Simon, a man whose biggest daily stress was supply chain logistics, wouldn't survive the proximity. Tessa closed her eyes. The rainwater ran down her cheeks, mixing with hot, sudden tears of profound frustration. "You're a monster," she whispered. The words weren't thrown as an insult. They were a quiet, devastating statement of fact. Nico didn't flinch. He just stood there, letting the rain wash over him, absorbing the truth of it. "I know." She opened her eyes, wiping her wet face with the back of a trembling hand. The anger was still there, burning hot and bright in her chest, but beneath it was a crushing, heavy exhaustion. She had spent 3 years fighting for a sliver of normalcy. She had saved for the dress. She had painted her nails. She had practiced making small talk in the mirror, and in 5 minutes, this man had ripped it all down to the studs. She pushed away from the wet brick wall. She didn't look at him again. She couldn't. She walked past him, giving him a wide berth, her cheap heels clicking erratically on the wet pavement as she reached for the heavy steel door. Nico didn't try to stop her. He turned slightly, watching her yank the door open. The blast of warm, garlic-scented air from the pub hit her face, a sickening contrast to the freezing rain. Tessa stepped inside, the heavy door groaning shut behind her, cutting off the sight of him in the dark. The pub was just as loud, just as crowded as it had been 5 minutes ago. Nobody had noticed the tectonic plates of her life shifting violently beneath her feet. The jukebox was playing a muffled Bruce Springsteen track. The bartender was pouring a draft beer. Tessa walked back down the narrow hallway, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She paused at the edge of the dining room, smoothing her damp hands down the front of her wet dress. She forced her breathing to slow. In, out. In, out. She walked over to the booth. Simon was looking at his phone. When he saw her, his face instantly softened into a relieved smile. "Hey, everything okay? You were gone a while." He noticed her wet hair, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Did you go outside?" Tessa slid into the booth. The cracked vinyl squeaked beneath her damp dress. She didn't look at the bar, but the hairs on the back of her neck were standing on end. She knew the mirror was there. She knew he was watching, a ghost haunting the periphery of her vision. "Simon," she started, her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to look at his kind, thoroughly decent face. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating weight in her stomach. I'm so sorry." Simon's smile faltered. He set his phone down on the table. "What's wrong? Are you sick?" "Yes," she lied, grabbing the lie like a life raft. "I don't feel well." at all. It just hit me all of a sudden in the restroom. I think it might be a migraine. The lights, the noise in here. Oh no, Simon said immediately, his concern genuine and immediate. He didn't question her. He didn't look suspicious. He just reached into his pocket for his wallet. Say no more. We're done. Let me get the check, and I'll drive you home. No! The word came out too fast, too sharp. Simon froze, holding a credit card halfway out of his leather wallet. He blinked at her, startled. Tessa scrambled to soften her tone, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles ached. I mean, you don't have to do that. My house is in the opposite direction of yours. I already called an Uber. It's pulling up now. Simon frowned, entirely confused by the sudden urgency. Tessa, it's pouring out there. Let me at least walk you out to the car. Simon, please, Tessa said, her voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. She looked at him, pleading with her eyes. Let it go. Please, just let me go. I just need to leave, right now. I'm so sorry about the evening. He stared at her for a long second. He wasn't stupid. He could see the absolute terror vibrating through her small frame. He didn't understand it, but he recognized that she was cornered. Slowly he put the credit card on the table to cover the drinks. Okay, he said softly, holding his hands up in a small gesture of surrender. Okay, if you're sure. I am. Thank you, Tessa breathed out, already sliding out of the booth. She grabbed her cheap faux leather purse. I'm sorry. She didn't wait for his reply. She turned her back on the safe, normal life, sitting in the booth, and walked fast toward the front doors. She didn't look at the bar. She kept her eyes fixed on the neon open sign glowing red in the window. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The street was dark, the streetlights reflecting off the deep puddles in the asphalt. The grey Honda Accord was parked in the lot, completely empty. Directly across the street, idling in the shadow of a closed auto body shop, was the black armoured Range Rover. The headlights were off. The engine was a deep, low rumble that she could feel in the soles of her shoes. The rain sheeted down the tinted windshield, making it impossible to see inside. But she didn't need to. She knew exactly who was waiting behind the wheel. Tessa pulled her purse tight against her chest, ducked her head against the driving rain, and crossed the street. She grabbed the heavy door handle of the SUV and pulled. It clicked open with a solid, metallic thunk of heavy machinery. She climbed up into the passenger seat, immediately surrounded by the smell of rich leather, ozone from the heater, and the lingering, sharp scent of his cologne. She slammed the door shut. The heavy armor sealed out the noise of the rain and the street entirely, plunging the cabin into a suffocating, insulated silence. Nico didn't say a word. He didn't look at her. He shifted the truck into drive, and the heavy vehicle glided away from the curb, merging smoothly onto the slick suburban road. Tessa sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. The heater vents were blasting hot air against her frozen, damp legs. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her core and rattled her teeth. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the pub was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell of disbelief. What had she just done? She had lied to a perfectly good man. She had run out of a restaurant like a criminal. And now she was sitting in the passenger seat of a multi-million-dollar war machine, being driven by a man who bought politicians and ordered violence over his morning espresso. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. The only sound was the rhythmic, heavy thud of the windshield wipers aggressively clearing the rain from the glass. They hit the highway, the streetlights passing over the windshield in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, illuminating the dark cabin in brief orange flashes. In one of those flashes, Tessa looked at him. Nico was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles stark white against the black leather. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking erratically beneath his right eye. He didn't look victorious. He didn't look like a man who had just won a prize. He looked entirely hollowed out, staring at the wet asphalt ahead with a grim, punishing intensity. The anger she had felt in the alley suddenly flared back to life, hot and bitter in her chest. "Did you enjoy that?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but in the silent cabin it sounded like a scream. Nico didn't move. He kept his eyes on the road. "No." "You ruined it," she spat out, the words tasting like copper on her tongue. "I hadn't been out in 3 years. 3 years, Nico. I just wanted to sit in a booth and listen to someone talk about their dog. I just wanted to pretend I belonged in that world." Nico's grip on the wheel tightened until the leather groaned in protest. "You don't belong in that world, and I belong in yours," she shot back, her voice rising, the carefully maintained wall of the subservient Maid crumbling into dust. She turned in her seat to face him fully. "I scrub bleach into your grout. I sweep up the glass when your men break things. I live in a studio apartment above a laundromat. Don't act like this is about where I belong. This is about you. You just couldn't stand the idea of something existing that you didn't control." Nico let off the gas. The heavy SUV slowed slightly in the right lane. He didn't yell back. He didn't defend himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low, so rough, she almost didn't hear it over the hum of the tires. "You think I want this?" he asked, his eyes briefly flicking over to her before returning to the road. The sheer, raw agony in his gaze made her breath hitch. "You think I want to sit in a dark office at 2 a.m, running background checks on a man who volunteers at an animal shelter? You think I enjoy knowing exactly how many sugar packets you put in your coffee, or recognizing the sound of your footsteps on the stairs?" He dragged a hand down his face, a jagged, exhausted movement. "I am a plague, Tessa. Everything I touch rots. I know that. I've known it since I was 20 years old. I try to keep you in the periphery. I try to stay out of the rooms you're cleaning. But then you smile at the landscaper, or you hum when you think the house is empty, and it feels like someone is driving a spike through my chest." Tessa stared at him, completely paralyzed. The raw, unfiltered confession hung in the warm air of the cabin. He wasn't flexing his power. He was admitting a profound, fatal weakness. "Then why did you make me leave?" she whispered, her anger dissolving into a confusing, terrifying ache. "Because I am selfish," Nico said, the words heavy and absolute. He turned his head, looking at her fully for the first time since she got in the car. The darkness in his eyes was absolute. "Because seeing another man touch you made me want to burn the entire building to the ground. And if you stayed in there, I would have." He turned back to the road. "I saved him, Tessa. Not you. I pulled you out of there to save him from me." Tessa slumped back against the heavy leather seat, her chest tight, her lungs refusing to draw in enough air. The implication of his words wrapped around her throat like a steel wire. He wasn't protecting her from a bad date. He was protecting the world from his obsession with her. The rest of the drive was passed in a heavy, charged silence. The hostility was gone, replaced by a dark, magnetic pull that terrified her far more than his anger ever had. They turned off the coastal highway, the heavy tires crunching onto the private, gravel road that led up the cliffs to the estate. The towering iron gates loomed out of the fog, severe and imposing. Nico hit a button on his visor. The heavy gates swung open slowly, the heavy metal joints grinding against the salt air. As the Range Rover rolled through the entrance and the gates locked shut behind them with a heavy final clang, Tessa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She wasn't arriving at 7 a.m. in her grey slacks with a bucket. She was arriving at 9 p.m., dripping wet in a green dress, brought here by the master of the house. The lines had been crossed. There was no going back to the bleach and the silence. The house was completely dark when they walked through the front door, save for the ambient security lights casting long, eerie shadows across the marble foyer. The silence of the mansion, which usually felt safe and sterile to Tessa, now felt entirely suffocating. They stood in the entryway, the heavy oak door locked behind them. They were both soaked. Water dripped from the hem of Tessa's dress onto the imported marble, forming a small, dark puddle. The mundane reality of the mess suddenly broke through the haze of adrenaline. Tessa's training kicked in, a desperate, automatic response to grab onto something familiar. "I'm dripping on the floor," she mumbled, looking down at the puddle. She took a step toward the utility closet down the hall. "I need to get a towel. The water will warp the finish if it sits." She didn't make it 2 steps. Nico's hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. An unyielding band of heat and calloused skin locking her in place. Tessa froze, her breath catching sharply in her throat. She looked down at his large hand wrapped around her delicate wrist, and then slowly traced her gaze up his arm to his face. Nico was staring at her. The exhaustion and the self-loathing from the car ride were gone, replaced by a dark, volatile hunger that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The veneer of the composed, terrifying mob boss had cracked entirely, leaving only a raw, unanchored man in an empty house. "Leave it," he said, his voice a gravelly scrape in the quiet foyer. "It's going to stain," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to pull her arm back, a half-hearted tug. He didn't let go. "I don't care about the floor, Tessa." He tugged her gently toward him. She stumbled slightly in her cheap heels, closing the distance between them until she was standing inches from his chest. The heat radiating off his body was overwhelming, cutting through the freezing dampness of her clothes. She could smell the bourbon he hadn't finished at the bar, mixed with rain and the dark, musky scent of his skin. He lifted his free hand, his movements hesitant, almost jerky, as if fighting his own instincts. He reached up and gently touched the side of her face. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, a tiny, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. His thumb was rough, calloused from years of gripping steering wheels and firearms, but his touch was impossibly light. He brushed a wet strand of brown hair away from her cheek, his fingers sliding into the damp, heavy hair at the nape of her neck. "Open your eyes," he commanded softly. She did. The air between them was electric, humming with a terrifying, inevitable gravity. She looked up into his dark brown eyes and saw her own fear reflected back at her, mingled with an answering, desperate heat she didn't want to acknowledge. "You ruined this," she told him, her voice shaking badly. She wasn't talking about the date anymore. She was talking about her job, her safety, her sanity. "You broke the rules. I'm the maid. You're the boss. This doesn't happen." "I broke the rules months ago," Nico admitted, his voice rough. His thumb stroked her jawline, mapping the soft, delicate curve of her bone structure. "The first time I caught myself watching you sleep on the couch in the staff room. The first time I noticed you smelled like cheap vanilla. I was broken long before tonight." "I have to work tomorrow," she whispered, a desperate, final plea to reason. "I have to scrub the bathrooms." "No, you don't," Nico said. His hand at the nape of her neck tightened slightly, angling her face up toward his. The possession in his voice was absolute, dark, and thrillingly heavy. "You are never touching a bucket in this house again." Tessa's breath hitched. The reality of what he was saying crashed over her. She was no longer staff. She was something else entirely. Something closer. Something infinitely more dangerous. She looked at his mouth. He was so close, she could feel his breath ghosting over her lips. The contradiction inside her tore her apart. The absolute terror of what he was, warring with a deep, dark, buried desire to be claimed by something that powerful. To stop fighting to survive the world and let him fight it for her. "Nico," she breathed out, using his name for the first time. It tasted forbidden on her tongue. Something feral and broken snapped behind Nico's eyes at the sound of his name in her mouth. He didn't wait any more. He dropped his hand from her wrist and wrapped both arms around her waist, crushing her against his solid chest. His mouth came down on hers. It wasn't a gentle, cinematic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and messy. It was the collision of a man starving to death and a woman realizing she was the feast. He kissed her like he wanted to absorb her, to erase the 3 hours she spent with another man, to imprint his ownership on her very cells. Tessa gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to push against his chest. But the push turned into a desperate grip. Her fingers curled into the wet fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to him as the room spun. The taste of him, dark, sharp, entirely male, flooded her senses. He backed her up, his heavy boots backing her cheap heels across the marble until her back hit the heavy oak of the front door with a solid thud. The impact jolted her, but he didn't pull away. He swallowed her soft groan, his hands moving possessively down her spine, pulling her hips flush against his. She could feel the cold, heavy metal of the gun in his shoulder holster pressing against her ribs. It was a terrifying, physical reminder of exactly who she was kissing. A man who dealt in death. A man who lived in the shadows. But right now, under his mouth, pinned against the heavy door of his fortress, she didn't feel like a maid scrubbing out the stains of his life. She felt alive, electric, and terrifyingly seen. Nico finally broke the kiss, dragging his mouth across her jaw to press his face into the damp crook of her neck. He was breathing heavily, ragged, uneven pulls of air, like a man who had just outrun a bullet. Tessa kept her hands clutched in his shirt, her chest heaving, staring blindly up at the dark, coffered ceiling of the foyer. The rain continued to lash against the bulletproof glass of the high windows. Tomorrow, the reality of this would hit them. The syndicate, the danger, the permanent destruction of her normal, quiet life. But tonight, standing in a puddle of water in the dark, Tessa knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty. She was never going back to the bleach. If your heart is pounding after that intense, messy, and dark collision between Nico and Tessa, you know this isn't your average fairy tale. We just crossed the point of no return, from the silent maid to the mob boss's ultimate obsession. What happens when the reality of his violent world fully crashes into her life? Will she survive being his weakness, or will it destroy them both? Hit that like button if you felt the tension. Share this story with your friends who love grounded, raw Mafia romance, and subscribe to the channel to hear what happens the morning after in the next chapter. Tell me in the comments, do you think Nico can actually protect her from his own world? See you next time.